Guys, we're crowdsourcing the volume, so we need your help. Yes, we can hear you all. Okay, guys, if something in the volume changes, please let us know. Um, Sorry again for the delay, and thank you so much for your patience. For those tuning in for the first time, my name is Adar Weinreb. I host these discussions bi-weekly, weekly. It really depends on at what pace I could set them up. Again, I'm hearing raise your volume. Hold on, I'm going to try to take the mic out. Is my volume better now?
Yeah, it's loud.
Yeah.
Volume's better now?
It's even loud a bit.
Too loud. Okay, well, I won't yell anymore. Okay, guys. So yeah, I do these discussions. Really, the idea here, we call them debates, but it's not a traditional debate. Sayf and Rudy are not here to defeat one another. That's not the goal. The goal is to have a vibrant discussion. We want to find common ground. We obviously won't agree on everything, but despite our differences, we want to show people that we could have a respectful conversation. And like I said, find common ground. The idea of this is to really, teach people about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also to show people what effective communication looks like. It's important to me. It's important to the guests. And, we're in challenging times in the world, like what's happening in America. Now more than ever, we could use respectful dialogue. So that's really what this is all about. It's about people from supposedly opposing sides coming together and finding common ground. I'm going to let the guests introduce themselves today. So guys, take turns a minute or two, introduce yourselves, tell them where you're at, what you do in life, what your passions are. Feel free.
Go for it.
Should I start?
Yeah.
All right. Well, hi, everyone. I see from the chat you're a very diverse group of people, which is fantastic that this issue is getting the interest of people from around the world. My name is Sayf, and I'm a Palestinian living in Jordan. Right now, I'm a law student in London, in the United Kingdom. And I'd definitely say that over the past year, I've learned more about this conflict. I've been trying to diversify my sources and hear new perspectives. And what I like to do for fun, I like to write and I like to hang out with my dog.
Cool.
Yeah.
So shalom, salam, everyone. Thank you, Adal, for organizing this and being able to host these great conversations. Thank you, Sayf, for being a part of this and being able to communicate and to engage. And hopefully in this conversation, we'll be able to transcend the conflict that we both exist in so we can create a better reality. I'm looking forward to it, and it's a pleasure to be speaking to someone that, from what I've seen so far, is both intellectual, compassionate, and honest about truly helping his population in the region around. So my name is Rudy Rochman. I'm a Jewish and Israel rights activist. I was born and raised in many different places. That's what happens when a population is displaced in diaspora. Sayf can kind of correlate with that. However, I always understood that my history, my culture, my identity comes from this land, the Levant. And I came back to this land in 2011. I served in the army here. After that, I went to Columbia University and opened up a group to fight for Jewish rights on campuses. Today, I live in Israel. I fight against anti-Semitism in every form it exists. But a large part of my activism, the thing that I think is most important, is to be able to find ways to transcend the current structures that we exist in. And that's not only with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also with the Israeli society. We have the left against the right, the religious against the secular, and all these divisions that exist that I think that should be torn down. And so, yeah, I'm a Jewish rights activist, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to a fruitful conversation.
Awesome, great. Before we get into the topics, I'd like to know where your families come from historically, just to give people a little context.
Rudy, if you want to start.
Sure. So both my parents were first generation born in France. I was also first generation born in France. I left at the age of 3. My father's side of the family survived the Holocaust by fleeing from Poland to France, and they hid in attics throughout the war. My mother's side of the family was born in Algeria and Morocco. They lived in a town called Oujda in Morocco, which is on the border of Algeria. And in 1948, there was a sort of pogrom and massacre of the Jewish community by the local Arab population. Now, that just doesn't define all the Arabs that were there locally. It doesn't define all the Arabs of Morocco. It doesn't define the Moroccan government. It defines those individuals that did that. However, my family was forced to leave everything and flee to France. And that's how both my parents were able to, get to France, start their lives there. And now I live in Israel.
Mm-hmm. Similar to Rudy, a person of diaspora always has his roots in many places. My four grandparents were all born in various Palestinian villages or cities prior to 1948. Over the next decade or two, they all were forcibly expelled or left for safety reasons. They lived for quite a while in Kuwait. But after the first Gulf War, they became two-time refugees and eventually came in Jordan, where I was born. I've briefly lived in Saudi Arabia, but I lived most of my life here.
Awesome. So Sayf, I just want to start by letting you explain a little something. Many Israelis, they wonder the difference between Palestinians in the West Bank and Palestinians in the East Bank. Many people say, well, Palestine exists. It exists in Jordan. The majority of the population there, the majority of Palestine is now Jordan, and the majority of Jordan is comprised of Palestinians. So what do you say to that? Is there a distinction between East Bank Palestinians and West Bank Palestinians?
There definitely is, and it's a valid question with a lot of history behind it. So if we look at, let's say, the beginning of the 20th century, we have the Middle East divided up. Well, the Arabs wanted a huge Middle Eastern United Kingdom. Britain said no. But you clearly have defined groups, defined civilizations that, though are all Arab, are distinct in their culture and their identity. And so Palestine was one of them. Even the Ottomans recognized that in the way they divided the administrative districts. They had their own culture, their own dialect. And in modern day Jordan, it was very much a Bedouin area. And in the north, you had some agricultural people, but they mostly even identified as Syrians. In the modern day, after the Nakba in 1948, when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were expelled, many of them went to Jordan. Some were naturalized and got citizenship, like I did, and some remained as refugees in refugee camps, like today. So when we talk about Palestinians, it's important that we're mostly talking about Palestinians within the context of Palestine, which is historic Palestine, or the British Mandate of Palestine, which today is West Bank, Israeli territories, Gaza, etc. And I identify both as a Palestinian and a Jordanian. I have roots in Palestine, but also in Jordan. But it's very dangerous to say that Jordan is basically Palestine, when you have such a melting pot of Syrians, Iraqis, and the Bedouin Jordanians who were here before us. And it's also I believe it's dangerous when someone says so, because, and I'm not saying that this is what most people believe, but there are some who do, that they use it to try and separate Palestinians in Jordan, or the general Palestinian diaspora, from their roots in Palestine. And that's a big part of distinction.
Okay. Thank you for that. I think, that's very interesting. People often, view the Arabs who were living in all of the land as just one monolithic group. But as you say, it's very different. Do you and your family have a yearning to return to your historic homeland?
We do, yeah. My grandparents, they frequently tell me stories about their homeland. One really notable one actually is my grandfather, who tells me stories about a close family friend of theirs who was a Jewish Arab, right? A Jewish Palestinian. And he tells me about how they were friends for a very long time, but when things started to escalate, they stopped seeing each other because they were afraid of going into a Jewish or Arab area and therefore being discriminated against, which is really unfortunate. But there is definitely a yearning, and the Palestinian identity is one we can't get rid of. Now, if we had the chance to, would we all return? I mean, obviously, there are the economic, practical considerations, but yeah, it is important to us to have to know that we could return to what we perceive to be our homeland.
Cool. Rudy, I know you. It seems like, unless I'm mistaken, everything Sayf said up until now, you're probably on board with, right?
For the most part, yes. I think there are different ways of articulating certain things. For example, when he says historic Palestine, I understand what he means. He means by the name of the land for the past 2,000 years was called Palestine. But I think a part of the nuance that exists within the pro-Israel Jewish side is that before it was called Palestine, it was called Judea. So it depends what we mean by historic. And I don't take offense when someone says historic Palestine if they just mean that this was the name of the land before it was called Israel and for the past 2,000 years. I understand that that's his experience and his expression, and it doesn't have to come at the cost of my connection with my history and my experiences. So I think there are certain things in the way we describe situations, along with, he said a part of Jewish Arab. My family, from my mother's side, we're living in Arab countries, and we're definitely not Arab in Arab countries. And for the most part, Jews don't identify as Arab, even though some speak Arabic, which is the technical term for being Arab. But we identify as Jews, and not necessarily a religion, because a religion is based on just a belief system. And even if you don't believe in the Torah or in Hashem, you're still a Jew, but more so the identity of a collective native population to this land. So we don't identify as Arabs. And I think the Jews that were living pre-48 were called Palestinians is absolutely right. And the reason that they were calling themselves Palestinians is because they were living in this land that was called the British Mandate of Palestine, or the land that the Ottomans were, controlling Palestine. That was the name of the land. And so they identified with the name of the land, like many peoples living in that land. So we definitely did pre-48 identify as Palestinian. Not so much as Arab, although some people may disagree. For the most part, we didn't. But again, for the most part, I'm completely on board with everything that Sayf said. I think it's just certain nuances in the way we project our narratives that are different, which is why these conversations are so important for us to be able to understand each other's experiences and how we tell our story, so that we can start telling a greater story that includes both of our stories within that same story.
Of course, I'm very aware of how I've even heard recently that calling yourself an Arab Jew or a Jewish Arab is even a political statement of some sort. Could you talk more about, do you think being Arab and Jewish are mutually exclusive, right? And of course, the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was a huge change in Jewish-Arab relations and identities. And that's a very modern change. Could you talk about how beforehand Jewish communities existed in the Arab world, to your knowledge, or from your personal experience?
Of course. I think it's important to be able to define the terms that we use within every conversation. And some people define Arab as someone who speaks Arabic and lives in a country that is Arab. So that could be Christian Arab, Jewish Arab, Muslim Arab, as long as you define it by that term. But when I look at the word Arab, Arabim, it's like a nation. It's the people from Arabia. They have a culture, a history, a language, religion, a lot of things that come out of the culture of Arabia. Now, although Jews for the past 2,000 plus years have been living amongst Arab nations, there are mentions of Jews even in the Quran that were living amongst other Arabs. We never identified as a part of their nation. We were always our separate Jewish nation. And there were even in the Quran laws for the Jews. Now, the Jews were supposed to be respected and allowed to practice and to follow their Torah. And we had dhimmi laws, but that's a clear separation where this is our cousin. This is another nation, a nation which we must respect. They are living amongst us, but they're from a different land. They're the Bnei Israel from the land of Israel. And so in my experience that we always had that separation. There were many times where there was amazing relations. I grew up on stories from my grandfather growing up in Morocco, where he had his best friends being the local Arabs, and he was a photographer, and the people loved him, and they would call him Bnei Yaakov because his father's name was Yaakov. And so a lot of relations were good. Unfortunately, things like they always do get politicized. People use certain things, and then there are tough experiences that we both experience, and that we tend to like brush the entire population by these tough experiences, which I think is a crime, because then we end up seeing the entire population, which we could live together, as our enemy. And when we start viewing the situation as that, we sort of create a dualistic narrative, zero-sum game, where it's, if we allow them to succeed, it means we are defeated.
Then we lose.
Exactly. Yeah. And by continuing that, I think it's the very fuel to this conflict, because I say often, there's no future without Israelis or Palestinians living in this land. And we must remove the walls that exist between us, both physically when we can, and starting with something psychologically, those walls. So that's my take on an Arab. And I have I think a particular take on not identifying as anything other than Jewish, Judean, Israelite, Hebrew, the same nation. I even was born in France, don't identify as French, because I recognize that although I was born there and my parents were born there, that's not my history, that's not my land, that's not my culture, that's not my language, and that's not my future, that's my experience. So I disconnect any association of experience to my core identity, because my kids, they'll be born in Israel and no one will call them French. So I'm not any different than my kids, than my parents, than my grandparents, than my grandchildren. We all come from Judea. So I particularly, people may disagree and see things differently. I think that all Jews are from Judea. That's why we're called Jews. And that's the synonym for Israelites, like it says in the Quran, or Ivrim, like it says in the Torah. And this is our population and our name.
So I actually, I think there are two things kind of that that really caught my attention when you were talking. One of them was how you referred to, even in the last 2,000 years, Jewish communities, not just in the Arab world, but around the world, you referred to them as a Jewish nation separate from any nation they live within. I want to ask, what's the significance of using the word nation here as opposed to ethnicity or culture? Because I wouldn't really say, it's difficult. Would you extend that logic to any ethnic group with a distinct culture living in a larger nation?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. And again, I think I need to define the terms that I'm using. I don't mean nation like American nation or like the British nation. I mean nation like the First Nations, the Native Americans. I mean nation like the Tibetans, the Yazidis, the Kurds, where it's not just, okay, we all live here, we all have this piece of paper, we all have this experience, thus this is who we are. There's a deep connection and culture rooted to this population that transcends generations and generations to come, and that allows them also to be fundamentally connected to a specific piece of land. Like for Tibetans, no matter where they're displaced, they always must return to Tibet. Maoris must return to their land, Polynesians, Aboriginals, and this is kind of what I mean by nation. I don't mean it in the modern sense of what we hear as nation. I mean it as we're the descendants of a collective that comes from there, that our identity, way of life, culture, language, history, aspirations, all comes from there. I mean, even I'm sure as someone who's obviously very intellectual, you've probably seen in some movies where Jews get married and then break a glass and yell Mazel Tov. And the breaking of that glass is one element of many elements within our culture to symbolize the destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman Empire and the promise that our children in this marriage will one day come back to Jerusalem and free the land. Now, I think what's important to understand is it's not freeing the land of the inhabitants. It's freeing the land of the British. It's freeing the land of the Ottomans. It's freeing the land of the Romans, of people that aren't local, that aren't from this region, that are imposing laws onto the native populations, onto the local populations, and preventing us from actually living and creating a civilization that functions for both.
So it's very much just the feeling that no matter where you are, no matter what language you speak, there's an inalienable connection to a piece of land, and also a feeling that, would you say that there's also a feeling that no matter where you live, you don't feel you'll ever fully be a part of it? Is that also part of what you're saying?
It's definitely a big experience for the vast majority of Jews. And there are Jews that may assimilate and may forget that and may not even understand their identity because they're born in the diaspora. And so they're disconnected from their language, their culture, even other members of their tribe, of their nation. Most of the tribes of Israel, we don't even know what tribes are from. Thankfully, I come from the tribe of Levi, which was passed down through my father. So I know what tribe I'm from, but there's a lot of things that were lost along the way. So there are people that might not see it this way. But the thing is about the rest of the world is the second that Jews forget who they are, anti-Semitism rises. And if they don't remember themselves, at some point, they're reminded in a harsher way.
Yeah.
Wait, Rudy, can you speak on that a little bit more? What that means, that anti-Semitism rises when Jews forget who they are?
Right. So anti-Semitism is not the same, but it's a form of xenophobia that exists. So let's look at it through the lens of, homophobia, racism, being anti-women. You are fundamentally against this group of people. Like, let's look at in the United States, right? Clearly, there has been large movements to fight for Black rights, especially right now, as it's a hot topic in the US with everything that's going on, not just because of George Floyd, but everything that's been going on before that. And, I support that movement. I support them ending the struggles and the oppression that they experience. However, if you look on college campuses, people are able to respond to racism. So Black students, for the most part, are intellectually conditioned to be able to respond to racism and are fighting for their rights. And of course, when you fight for your rights, there's a lot of struggle and pain that follows with that. People die, people get beat up, people get jailed. So they're fighting for their rights. And by fighting for their rights, things are getting better. Clearly, in 70 years, where Black people didn't have rights, to today, things have got better. There's still plenty of much more to go into change. But when you are aware of your identity and the struggles that your people face, you fight against it and it's, gets better. When it comes to the Jews, whenever anti-Semitism rises, it usually rises in communities where the Jews are very disconnected to who they are. They've very much so assimilated and forgot what it was to be a Jew. They now see it as like a secondary religion, which was basically what Napoleon imposed onto the Jews to decide. And when we don't understand who we are, we don't understand what we are, and anti-Semitism rises because there's always going to be forms of xenophobia, like racism, being anti-women, being anti-Jews will always exist. However, if that population and their allies don't realize what's happening and stand up and fight against it, naturally it will grow. It's our responsibility to fight against it in order to prevent it from happening again, which is why after the Shoah, after the Holocaust, we say never again. Doesn't mean it's not going to happen again. It means we take a commitment to make sure it doesn't happen again. So that's what I mean, that when we don't know who we are, we don't know where we're from, we don't know how to fight back, it rises because of that, because it's our responsibility to prevent it from rising.
Mm-hmm. Just to make sure I understood what you're saying, because it was kind of long. Are you saying that when Jewish people forget their Jewish identity or gain a dual identity or assimilate more into another culture or identity, they tend to be less defensive or assertive about their Jewish identity, which means that anti-Semitic movements or sentiments go unchallenged for longer?
Historically, yes. Historically, yes. There's a little bit more to that. Anti-Semitism starts to penetrate the societies, where usually it starts off with small radical movements, usually on the extremes, so the extreme right, the extreme left. So it starts off like that, and then it starts to become mainstream. And it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. It usually happens, a few decades, and it happened even in Germany. The first people pushing Hitler's views and policies were the students on campuses. Like, students did Kristallnacht, where they smashed all the stores of the Jews in Germany. And so what happens usually is shifting the conversation, the mentality, the ideology of the younger generation eventually becomes mainstream. And if Jews don't recognize that and make the society understand that that is something wrong, then by nature, it will eventually manifest itself into something greater.
Well, here's my take on this. I guess there are two things I kind of want to say. One is I want to discuss the nation component of the Jewish identity you're describing. If that's your belief, then obviously I can't say that, no, you don't believe that. But I do want to point out that there is a long history of Jewish identity that didn't necessitate this national component. A cultural one, yes. A religious one, absolutely. But definitely not a national one, which I believe is part of the reason that when Zionism started emerging in the late 1800s, for many decades, it was not the common or even popular ideology amongst many Jewish people, right? And I don't say this I'm not saying this in that I'm telling you what you believe. No, because you're one Jewish person, you have your own beliefs. But we also can't say that this is what all Jews believed and what all Jewish communities believed. So you have reformist Jews in Central Europe who resoundingly rejected Zionism. You have socialist Jews in Russia. You have Victorian Jews in Britain. Of course, Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews who, as I understand, are still not very Zionist even within Israel, but they are there because they can further their religious studies there, right? So what I think it's important to recognize that if you ascribe your Jewish identity to a national movement, well, I can't tell you anything, right? Because that's a very personal thing to you. But I also think it's problematic when someone says that this is what applies to all Jewish people and has happened to all Jewish people, because many Jewish people today are anti-Zionist, and for centuries, the national component of Judaism wasn't even a common one for many Jewish communities. Now, whether you believe that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's another debate, right? If you want to say that, hey, we should cling on to a national identity, that's another thing. But I have a question for you now. What does it mean for there to be a Jewish nation? What does that look like? What's it made of? And what does it mean when someone says Israel is a Jewish nation, right? Or when someone says Israel should be a Jewish nation?
Just Rudy, before you take the floor, I just want to make a comment on what you said, Sayf. So, as somebody who's definitely less of a nationalist than Rudy, I see myself kind of in the middle ground here. It's true that Jews are not a monolith, never were. They aren't today, they never will be, like any other group, right? So some Jews are just culturally Jewish, some Jews are ethnically Jewish, and some Jews, a homeland is very, very important to them.
Mm-hmm.
For the past 2,000 years, Jews, have lived all over the world. Some of them have always dreamed of returning one day to Israel. It's in some of the prayers, but it seems like such a pipe dream. You're living in Europe. How are you going to go move all the way to Israel? There's people living there. How are you going to move there and create a homeland? So even people who wanted it may not have seen it as realistic, right? Herzl was like an extremist. He was a radical. Like, what a crazy idea. My cat is scratching the chair behind me. So I'd say it's very hard to know what Jews for the past 2,000 years have wanted. What it seems to be is, many Jews were part of their local, the communities they lived in. They were content or they were persecuted, depending on the time and the place. And then I think many Jews just had a very deep yearning to return to the land, and finally got an opportunity to do so. So I hope that just gives you a little bit of like clarity of the difference between different Jews, and what mentality and psyche has been for the past few thousand years. And Rudy, feel free to add anything you'd like on that.
Sure. First of all, I think these conversations are so important to have, both for Jews to internalize and understand elements of Jewish thoughts, both for Palestinians to understand our perspective, and for Jews and everyone that's listening to understand Palestinian perspectives. And a lot of times Palestinians have not heard about Jewish identity and Jewish story, and most of the time Jews have not heard about Palestinian story. So this is why it's so important, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation. So let's just talk about a fact. the Jews came from a civilization called Judea. You know, this Jewish people aren't a religion and a belief system that stemmed all across. We're a physical nation that came out of a civilization. Many of us stayed in this land, and most of us were kicked out. We were taken by the Roman Empire into Rome and eventually spread out. Some went into Spain, some went into, the Ashkenaz region of Europe, and some even went to Asia, and some even left before that during a earlier expulsion into the Middle East. So Jews, although live everywhere, it is a fact that they descend from a civilization and a homeland. Now, when we were displaced, when you experience traumas, not only the trauma of being displaced from your home, but the constant persecution that you experience in the lands that you live in, there are ways in which someone reacts to certain traumas. And the way I see the Jewish people reacting to anti-Semitism, wherever it exists and whatever time, is similar to a way that, a woman reacts to a horrible situation where a husband is beating their wife. So there are three things, in my opinion, that a woman can do in that situation. The first is to leave that situation and fight back, which is something that I see myself doing when I face anti-Semitism. I don't stand up for it. I don't allow it to happen. I fight back to it. The second thing is to make excuses for it, ignore it, just brush it under the table, which in my opinion is what most Jews do in America, what most Jews do historically, and to the communities that were in Europe when it comes to talking about homeland, what they were basically doing is just let it be, let us live our lives. And the third is to blame yourself for it. So unfortunately, some women in those circumstances say, no, it's actually my fault. I shouldn't have done this. I shouldn't have done that. The blame should go on me. And oftentimes, many people that deal through trauma, especially also passed down generational trauma, have also that mindset. So many Jews that are against their empowerment, their aspirations, it's often from a place of, no, I can't be strong and survive as an independent, strong person. I must be at the hands of my oppressors and live in mental and physical slavery in sometimes. So the way I see it, it is true that many people, when Zionism was coined, were against Zionism, many Jews. That being said, something that is often not understood is that there were many movements that sought throughout history to do what Zionism did. The only reason we know about Zionism is because it's the only one that succeeded, and the last one that actually occurred, which is why we know about Zionism. However, there are many movements of Aliyah, of bringing the Jews back to Israel, conversations of people coming back to the homeland. And I'm not going to speak about my opinions and impose them on the Jewish people. However, it is a fact that collectively the Jewish people, as a part of our aspirations, is to come back to our land. Like I said, when we smash a glass, when every single Jew gets married, it's about coming back and reviving Jerusalem. Every single Pesach, we say Shana Ba B'Yerushalayim, we pray towards Jerusalem. Now, the religious side, the religious Jews aren't against the creation of Israel, aren't against Jews living in Israel. They're against Jews doing it now, because they believe that God has to come and bring Mashiach, Messiah, and once this day comes, then we can enter into the land of Israel. And they're against Zionism, particularly because it was done mostly at that time by secular Jews, which is a whole other big issue that, if Orthodox Jews do something, then the secular Jews are like, oh, that's not good. And if the secular Jews do, and vice versa, the fact that secular Jews were the ones who pushed forward Zionism was largely rejected by a lot of Orthodox people. Today, most Orthodox people fully support Israel because they see it, okay, it can't be, if I'm religious, if I'm Orthodox and I believe everything happens for a reason, and clearly Hashem wanted this to happen, most people have aligned themselves with, yes, we believe Israel has a right to exist, but there are still many changements that have to occur within Israel for it to be a Jewish enough state, meaning people shouldn't suffer anymore. The government shouldn't be corrupt. We shouldn't have a British parliamentary system in the Middle East. We should create a system that is just for the populations, and so on and so on. So when it comes to Reform Jews, this is a community that was very disconnected to their identity. So of course, they don't want to talk about anything that makes them seem like an other, because they were all about making them seem as part of the society. So talking about going back to a homeland is not a part of their mindset. And when it comes to the Orthodox Jews, they're for going back to Israel, but not yet until somehow Hashem comes and reveals himself and makes us go to Israel. Now, to answer the question about how do I see the Jewish nation? It's a very important conversation. And I think we have to first break down why Judaism is not a religion, which I briefly touched on before. And like I said before, a religion is a belief system in a God, deity, book, or a prophet. And if you're a Jew and you don't believe in your God, deity, book, or prophet, you're still a Jew. And in order to become a Jew, you have to go through years of a process of adapting an identity, a history, a language, a culture, a value system, even the suffering that comes along with being a part of that nation, and then be approved by a council of elders to become part of that nation. Actually, Native Americans have a very similar process where you can become Native American and integrate to the population through a series of tests that take time and be approved by a group of elders. So it's actually very similar to how someone joins a collective Native nation. How do I have a vision for a Jewish civilization, a Jewish country, a Jewish state? Now, when we say a Jewish state, we definitely don't mean the Jewish religious elements being imposed onto the populations living here. We mean a Jewish state, a Jewish country, the same way that Tibetans mean a Tibetan country, the same way that Nepalese mean a Nepalese country, the same way that any form of minority indigenous population wants to recreate their civilization or live in their civilization with that culture. That doesn't mean that non-Jews can't live in that society and be fully equal citizens and a part of our society equally. Now, actually, we had that in Judea. We had non-Jews living in Israel that were fully equally. There's no greater laws for Jews than there are for non-Jews. So my vision, personally, this is where I'm going to speak personally, of what I think a Jewish civilization should be, is the Jewish culture, language, system, things being revived as any native civilization should have, but also creating a space for other populations that either move into the land or have lived there for a long period of time, and allow the civilization to be Palestinian enough for Palestinians and Jewish enough for Jews. So we should be focusing on creating a reality that encompasses both of our needs, which I fundamentally think and believe doesn't contradict, and creating a reality that also focuses on dealing with the sufferings that we both experience, which are not the same. What Palestinians go through, which is horrible, is not what Jews go through. And what Jews go through is not what Palestinians go through. So we have to stop playing this game of comparing our sufferings or playing some sort of Olympics about it, because both are intertwined. Both will continue if one continues. And we have to focus on conversations to figure out, okay, what are those sufferings happening? How do we fix them? And what are the needs that both populations fundamentally need to achieve in order to have their dignity, humanity, values, everything back? And how do we build that reality? And that is, I think, the most fundamental conversation we need to have, that is so many times prevented and oftentimes by foreign powers, which profit from this conflict continuing.
Right. Adar, you want to say something?
Sayf, let me just chime in real quick. Rudy, I just want to clarify a point that I don't want to get misrepresented, but it's quite possible you can be a Jew who does not care about living in Israel, but that is not necessarily a sign of you being weak or blaming yourself for your situation. It's completely
misinformation and not knowing your history.
Well, but even if you know your history, it's completely acceptable to be a diaspora Jew and be completely content with where you live. No one needs to, you don't need to be a Zionist. You don't need to want to come back.
I never in my life ever said that Jews need to physically choose to displace themselves to Israel. I believe that we need to get out of mental slavery, not of physical slavery. So mentally, through our assimilation, which I think is a bad thing. Of course, we should have integration, be a part of other societies. But I think ridding yourself or losing, whether willingly or unwillingly, your culture that you've inherited for thousands of years and that we seek to pass down for the next thousands of years, the fact that you lose it, to me, is not necessarily like their fault. It's also because they necessarily weren't taught about their identity. So again, I'm never saying that all Jews should move to Israel. Anyone should live wherever they want to, as long as they respect the society and the laws that they live amongst. So I'm not saying that all Jews should live there, but I do think that when Jews aren't connected to their land, they are also not connected to a fundamental part of their identity and history.
Well, here's I guess my response to that. I agree with a lot of what you said. But not all of it, which is why we're having this dialogue, this discussion, right, between different sides. This doesn't just go when we talk about Jewish identity. I'd apply this to every single type of identity, whether it's religious, ethnic, national, or any other. It's that there's no one way to be Jewish. There's no one way to be Arab. There's no one way to be anything, right? And identities are complex things because they're intangible, because people disagree. When I speak as a Palestinian, I'm not speaking on behalf of all Palestinians. And when you speak on Jewish people, you're not speaking on behalf of all Jewish people. And that's because there are different ways to be Palestinian and different ways to be Jewish. And so that's why I believe, if you believe that the way you feel most comfortable being Jewish, the way you feel the most truest being Jewish and identifying as a Jewish, is by maintaining those ties to a land, or by adhering to certain values and a language, then it's not that that's wrong. That's what works best for you. But what I'm feeling when you say that, oh, the Jews who don't feel this connection to Israel or to Palestine or to this land, it's because they're uneducated or are forgetting a part of themselves. I think that's sort of saying that there's one way to be Jewish, and saying otherwise is forgetting a part of that original way. And there's a second part. You can be, having different identities they don't have to contradict one another, right? Unfortunately, this is an issue everyone struggles with, right? When a person immigrates from their homeland to another country, and then they go back years later, they find themselves feeling like they don't belong neither here nor there. So it's a very troubling issue, and one that everyone for millennia has struggled with. But it's important to realize that when you adopt a new identity or parts of a new identity, that doesn't mean you're neglecting or forgetting or abandoning a previous identity. So, and I'm not just saying this in regards to the debate over, what does it mean to be Jewish, or, the components of that identity, but because it's something I've struggled with as a Palestinian who lives in Jordan and now studies and will likely work in the United Kingdom. Is something that we all need to acknowledge. And I think it's dangerous and can even cause negative emotions in people when someone says, there's only one way to be this. And, if you're not adhering to that, then you've forgotten your true self, or you've abandoned your true self. And I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to what you said, Sayf, because I agree for the most part. A similar version of this, many Jews, religious Jews, would say, actually, to be Jewish, you just need to follow the Torah. It's less about the land, more about the Torah. They're coming more from a religious perspective. Rudy, you're coming more from a nationalistic perspective. So that, it just shows that there are differing opinions for really what it means to be Jewish. And for me, I actually look at it more of, I'm an ethnic Jew. I do live in Israel. I love Israel, but I don't think that's what makes me Jewish. I'm an ethnic Jew. I come from the Jewish people. We have a shared history, somewhat of a shared culture, and it's just cool. I enjoy that. But to me, I don't see beyond that. And many people would say that I'm just, how do you say it in Hebrew? They say dati light, Yehudi light, like a diet Jew. But whatever. I think it's wrong to make that claim, but it just shows how many varying opinions there are, right? There's how I view my Judaism, Rudy, there's how you view your Judaism, and many others, and then there's religious people who view it in slightly different terms.
Yeah, so again, amazing conversation. You're absolutely right that there's not one way of being Jewish, and that's actually a fundamental Jewish idea. The reason why we're called the nation of Israel, Bnei Israel, why not the nation of Abraham? Why not the nation of Isaac? Why specifically the name of Jacob? Why not the nation of Jacob? Why specifically his second name, Israel? And the reason is because when Abraham passed down the culture, the identity, the value, the realization of the world being part of oneness to Isaac, Isaac accepted everything. And when Isaac passed it down to Jacob, he actually wrestled with the concept. And he wasn't willing to just accept it just like that. And because he wrestled with that concept, he was able to transcend and truly understand. And the reason we're called Israel, which means Yashar La'el, a path to Hashem, a path to oneness, is because we believe fundamentally as Jews that each one of us as individuals have to wrestle with our identity, with our relationship with that higher force, with who we are in order to transcend that. And we all have our own ways to do that. And that way also changes with time. What worked for me 10 years ago will not work for me now, will not work for me in 10 years. So I absolutely do believe that every Jew has their own way of expressing the way they practice their Judaism. However, there is one Jewish language, and that's Hebrew. There is one Jewish population. There is one Jewish homeland. And that is something that is eternal and internal to the Jewish people. And even if someone chooses to reject it, it can't be taken out of fact and history. The Jews come from Judea within their culture as their people. Like all of our traditions are about returning to Israel. Even if someone doesn't want to do it in practice, it's still a fundamental part of our culture. And I don't think you would tell Native Americans that if you find a few Native Americans that say, you know what, well, we want to become Americanized and we don't care about our native nations, tribe, and our deities and our cultures and our language, and neither should they, you wouldn't tell the collective of Native Americans that their identity and connection to the land, their history, their language doesn't exist or isn't the fundamental part of their nation. So, the reason why I think most Jews that aren't connected to Israel have that perspective, and again, I'm not saying that they're bad or they're weak. It's not that at all. It's they're disconnected because of the experiences that we went through in the diaspora. Similarly to how many people of color living in America and South America and in the Caribbean don't know which tribes they come from in Africa, don't know which language they spoke, because along the way they lost their identity. And I see that as a crime. Because I'm by the way, I'm definitely not a nationalist in the sense of what nationalism is today. When we say Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel, we mean it as sort of native nation, not a nationalistic nation of what empires believe in today. So I disconnect to that, but we have a collective identity that comes from a collective homeland, that comes from a certain region that has a certain language. And yes, after that exists, there are people that choose to express it in certain ways, more religiously than others, more culturally than others, more, in many different ways, and they have a right to. But I think it's important to understand that it is a fundamental part of who we are. And I don't think anyone would tell Maoris, Aboriginals, Tibetans that their homeland is not a fundamental part to who they are. So I don't think that people should tell us that Judea, our native civilization, our native land is not important to who we are. Whether Jews agree with it or not as individuals, it's still a fundamental part of Jewish history and Jewish culture.
I do want to comment on that. You do make a good point, and it's great that we both acknowledge that there is not one way or one right way to identify as whatever identity you have, right? And no one is weaker or faker for being different or for ascribing to their identity differently, whether that's integrating new components or discarding older ones. Now, there is one thing, and it's that it's the idea of a homeland, and it's the idea of saying originally from. Let's take an example. In the true, honest sense of the word, no one is originally from anywhere. And let me talk about it. Do African Americans today have an inalienable right to land back wherever their ancestors came from in Africa? Right? Some will say yes, right? And I think it really depends on the context, because everyone, identities are very abstract, right? They're very abstract, and oftentimes we attempt to root them in some objective physical reality, but more often than not, they're not. Identities have fluctuated over time. People have changed how they identify. They've discarded labels and introduced new ones. They've changed homelands and chosen new homelands. So here's my issue with Zionism, because I do have a very major issue with Zionism. I don't have an issue with a Jewish person looking at, and for lack of controversy, let's call it mandatory Palestine, right? The British mandate of Palestine. Mandatory Palestine, if a Jewish person, wherever they are, whether they're in Yemen or Germany, looked at that land and said, I feel a personal connection there and I want to go there, that's valid, right? It's the same thing as anyone can feel a personal connection to a piece of land. Immigrants went to the US because they felt an intimate personal connection with the idea of an American dream, with being in a free nation, right? This one was rooted in principles like freedom or mobility. For the Jew, it was embedded in ideas of history and ancestry. That's okay. What many Palestinians take issue with Zionism is that it was a movement of people who said, we get to go to this land against, although the people who live there now, who aren't the same people who kicked us out, and they've been there for centuries, they don't want us to, and they're currently being subjugated by a foreign power. But we're gonna go there, and we invalidate their feelings that they should have the right to control what happens to their self-determination and that land that they've been living in. And that then we demand an exclusive right to parts of it, right? So that's the issue there. Now, if, let's say, Zionism didn't happen, Jewish migrations to Palestine didn't happen, and there's a Palestinian state, it's Arab majority, of course, some of them are the Jewish families who've lived there for centuries or millennia. If they reject a Jewish person coming there for being Jewish, that's called anti-Semitism, right? But that's not what happened earlier. It was just a feeling of helplessness that there were people who haven't lived amongst us for centuries that speak a different language, and they're coming here against our will, and they're saying, we demand an exclusive part of this land, and for it to be exclusive, many of you are gonna have to leave. And so also, I forgot to address this earlier, and I apologize for that. When you gave your answer to what a Jewish nation is, you correctly acknowledged that, right? It doesn't mean non-Jews don't live there. It doesn't mean that non-Jews don't participate, contribute, they're not equal. But I do want to ask, and I'm going to say this from my perspective, and you can say whether that's true or not, but this is the perspective that most Palestinians share. When Palestinians say, we want Palestinian refugees who were displaced in the wars to be able to come back because they were displaced against their will, or when Palestinians say, hey, we want a one-state solution, all the territories should be for everyone, both Jews and Arabs to share, right? One of the biggest responses that we believe we hear is fears from Israeli politicians and Israeli leaders saying, when we do that, we accept more Arabs, more non-Jews, and we feel that takes away from the Jewish character of our nation. And therefore, we're not going to let these people in or let this number of people grow, because we feel that threatens who we are. And so we're going to stop them on an ethnic basis. And I want to hear your response on that. Like,
yes,
what do you think? How do you feel? And is there a misperception of that? Or, and of course, like we said, obviously, no one group is homogenous. So, some people might share this, some people might not. What's your take on it?
Sure. So I'm going to go in order because I want to make sure that I address the previous points, and then I'll talk about the displacements and right of return. So when it comes to identities, you're right that they are born at some point. At some point we all came from Africa, according to many scientists, and at some point we came from bacteria in the ocean. I mean, even the days of creation, they're listed literally in the order of evolution. So at some point we came from somewhere, but I do think that when you establish a native identity, there's still an importance to it. The same way, at some point you didn't have parent, brothers, and family, and at some point you were created and you became important, and this family became important. So just because at some point this identity was created doesn't mean it's no longer important. And I think if someone argues that there should be, I'm not saying that you're doing this, but if someone argues that there should be no native nations, no identity of separatism at all, and we should all be one human race with no borders, then I think that is the only way, in my opinion, that one can be against Zionism and not be anti-Semitic, because they're not holding a double standard. They're just against the concept of nations having their identity. And I don't think anyone would necessarily do that. So if you don't do it to another native nation and don't tell Native Americans or Tibetans, yeah, you came there, but at some point you came from somewhere else. So do you really have a right? If that same logic is not applied to other populations, I don't think it should be applied to the Jewish people. Now, the reason why I think it's important to have differences, and what I mean differences, I mean like this family, is because the way Judaism, the mystical part of Judaism, Kabbalah, which I very much so connect to the philosophy of Kabbalah, it sees the world as one body. We are one body, and nature and time and space and populations, we are all elements of this one body. And it's also a part of the Quran to talk about this oneness, and Allah, Hashem, is the creator, this divine energy that is the oneness, which Jews and Muslims both connect to, this concept of this oneness. And I see identities when it comes to the Tibetans, when it comes to the Jews, when it comes to even the Palestinians. We're all different organs within this body. Now, it is one body, but each organ needs to also know its purpose in that body. And their purposes may be different. They are all equally important. If you lose your liver, if you lose your heart, if you lose your brain, the body doesn't function. The body becomes sick. So it's important to understand that we are all one, but we are all many parts that make up that one. And I think there's a beauty in that as well. There's this oneness of the family, and there's this individuality that also exists within the individuals of the family. When it comes to Zionism, if Zionism was, as you define it, of our goal is to come and to kick out the people that were living there, I'd be against it too, because fundamentally that's not a Jewish concept. When I say Zionism, and when the vast majority of people that identify as Zionists today talk about Zionism, we only connect to the concept that Jews should have a right to be able to live there. We don't at all associate or even think in our minds about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the conflict with Arabs and anything else. We just think about it in our way of thinking that we used to live there, it was our civilization, a crime was committed against us, and we need to return back. Now, what happened with the unfortunate realities putting Zionism into practice is there was another player there other than the local Arabs and the local Jews. It was the British. And the British played a tremendous role into what they do everywhere, divide and conquer. They weaponize our struggles, our current realities, our aspirations against one another. Even the putting the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem as the leader of the Palestinians that was imposed by the British. And this person being so vehemently anti-Semitic, even meeting with Hitler, talking to him about him one day being able to come there. This is not, in my opinion, the true representation of the Palestinian population. Neither is the PA, neither is Hamas, in my opinion. However, the problem is that the British played our struggles against one another. They made the Jews feel that the Arabs would always reject you and always fight you. And, it was also experienced that many Arabs did reject the Jews, fought the Jews, the Arab countries attacked Israel, certain militia groups within the British Mandate of Palestine, like in 1929 with the Hebron massacres. But that doesn't define all Palestinians. That doesn't define all Arabs. That doesn't define the population, the real people. So we were kind of tricked into, again, seeing one versus the other. And I think a big problem is that when a lot of Palestinians hear us talking about Zionism, it's as if we're making excuses for what happened. I think it's a crime for what happened. But I don't think the crime is the intention of what the Jews came here to do. The intentions of what Jews came here to do, I don't think you'd be against it, because it represents exactly what you were saying before, Jews wanting to come here and live in one civilization. So when it comes to displacement, you'll never hear me saying I'm against the right of return or I'm against undoing the circumstances. I think it's a part of the conversation that we need to have. It's a part of the understanding. How do we do that? How do we do that practically, not just on an idea? And how to do that in a way that doesn't, I have just two more points. How do we do that in a way that doesn't hurt our aspirations? And how do we do our aspirations that doesn't hurt your aspirations? And I believe, when I don't say one state, but I say one civilization. I believe in one civilization without any physical or psychological walls that allows all the populations to be able to live there and to achieve their aspirations. And I think it is possible to do so.
Cool.
Adar?
So Rudy, wouldn't you agree though that Sayf's point is probably important? It's an important part of the reconciliation process. Now, I do want to get to a point where we're not, even in this discussion, where we're not talking about history and the philosophy of, who deserves more. I want to talk about the fact that two populations are living here. How do we make it work? Just because I think a lot of people want to hear that discussion as well. But reconciliation seems to be an important part to build the necessary trust. And Rudy, I'm not saying you don't do this, because I know you do recognize this, but I think many Israelis don't. It's not part of our culture. It's not part of our school system. We do not acknowledge the injustices
on both sides, and that's the problem.
Yeah, for sure. But, as a Jew, I'm speaking, about the Jewish people, and there definitely reconciliation works both ways. But there have been many injustices committed towards the Palestinian people. It started prior to 48. We bought lands from Ottomans. It wasn't the Ottomans' lands for us to buy from. You had Palestinians living there for many generations, and we came and said, oh, now you need to leave. So, and many Israelis, you tell them that, it's like, yeah, but we bought it legally. But that doesn't mean it's not unjust. You can't just kick somebody out of their home who's been living there for centuries, right?
I'm against the kicking out of any local
I know.
population.
We're in agreement here. I just want to bring this forth because I think it's very important. Israelis and Palestinians alike, but Israelis need to acknowledge the injustices that have been committed towards the Palestinians. It seems to be an essential part to the peace process. And as I'm saying this, I know there's people watching who are cringing. This actually bothers them to hear, because the concept of us acknowledging that we committed an injustice is so foreign. It's so much not a part of Israeli society today that people get upset just by this notion. But so that's why I'm saying this.
I think just it's not that we committed the injustice. It's that the situation and many actors and individuals committed those injustices. The same way there were things that were done by Palestinians onto Israelis, onto Jews, and we wouldn't say that's what the Palestinians collectively did, but we would want the Palestinians to collectively understand that pain and that struggle. I think we need to apply the same thing to the Jews. The Jews didn't I didn't live before 48, right? I was born in 1993, so I'm not responsible for any action of anyone else. And I think that's something we need to understand, that we are responsible for our own actions and our own opinions. And once we understand that, we actually have the ability to create new actions, to create new realities. However, we need to recognize, and this is where I agree with both of you, the struggles, the pains, the identities, the experiences that both through. And I think the source of that problem is that we were never able to actually come together. We were always seeing us versus them. And the reason why people cringe at what you're saying is because they still see it as us versus them. And that's what I think we need to break down.
Yeah, I agree. You and I are not responsible for the injustices committed towards the Palestinians. Sayf is not responsible for our friends who have been murdered in terrorist attacks. That being said, part of building peace is acknowledging, that our societies today and in the past have committed injustices towards one another, and acknowledging that, I think, is just a very important step towards moving forward, because we've all been victimized by this conflict, and we will continue to be victimized by this conflict if we don't find a way to move forward.
100%. I absolutely agree. There were many injustices committed between Arabs and Jews, right? Whether it's the fact, the Deir Yassin massacre, a Palestinian village where it was completely burned down by Israeli forces, men, women, children were shot, or whether it's the fact that there were huge anti-Semitic riots in Yemen, in Morocco, in the late 40s, in the early 50s, that left many Jewish people there, Arab Jews, though that's a political statement, but for lack of a better word, who were victims there. And that definitely needs to be acknowledged as well. And unfortunately, us Arabs, we don't acknowledge that. And that's a very unfortunate thing. But I do want to bring up a few things. First off, it's about about the terminology we use, Jews or Zionists. When we discuss, I feel that when we discuss the history of what happened in the 20th century, or at least in the first half, Zionist is definitely a better word, because it much more accurately reflected who was active. It wasn't, the non-Zionist Jews across Europe, across the Middle East, because believing that the Jews in Yemen or Iraq or Morocco were responsible for what happened is unfortunately what fueled so much anti-Semitism. So it's not an ethnic group that did it. It's not a religious group that did it. It's a political, ideological group that did it, and that's a Zionist group. But you're also right that when we say these words, when we throw around these terms, it's too easy to lump in too many people together. You're not responsible for what happened. You're absolutely not. And I'm not responsible for what happened either. There's another thing I want to mention, which is the British aspect you brought. The British have not been victims of much in history. They subjugated Jews, Arabs, Africans, Indians, and so many other people around the world to immense atrocities. But I do have to say that framing it as, a problem that was escalated by the British, the pain of which was paid by these two peoples, I think it takes away from how it started. Adar, I'm aware of what you said, that you don't want to turn this into a historical debate, right? You don't want to start debating events or, what actually happened. And, of course, this is not
stuck on it for the next, hour or so. But no, feel free to address it, and then, Rudy will respond, and then we'll try to find the path to addressing, just practical things.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So the reason I think history is so important to bring up is because it paves a way through how the future plays out, right? Because when you say, oh, why can't two people get along? The reason you find that out, and you find out how they can get along, how they can unite, how can they contribute to the prosperity of each people, by exploring their historical dynamics. Now, I want to bring up something, and I'm actually going to say that we don't have to disagree on it, right? Because usually when someone brings up what I said, or when someone brings up what you said, people usually perceive them to clash, but they don't have to. And that's that Zionism was a settler colonial movement. Now, you say Zionism is a national aspiration movement for the Jewish people, right? But do those two things really contradict one another? Because because what Europe saw were Jewish refugees fleeing the mass persecution they just experienced, the atrocities, right? And that was only the final chapter in a long history of persecution, in a long history of subjugation. They saw them as a Jewish people who were looking for a better things, right? That's what they saw from their backs, fleeing from Europe, going to this new land. However, from the front, it was the face of a foreigner. It was the face of someone who said, I want a land here, and it has to be exclusively my land and not yours, because that's what the Palestinians saw. So Zionism being a settler colonial movement doesn't contradict it being a national movement. Often settler colonial movements are that. America, the established America, was a colonial movement, the victims of which were the Native Americans who've lived there for millennia. However, they were also a national movement that sought to distance themselves from the Brits, that sought to redefine themselves, that sought to create a home in that land. And so when we discuss how we're going to move forward, we need to acknowledge what the Zionists were, right, in the initiation of this conflict, and who the Palestinians were. The Zionists were colonizers, and the Palestinians were being colonized. They were being told, you must leave. And in the most moderate version, they were being told, you must now share this land with us, though we came without your consent, and though we came with the consent of a British foreign occupier, imperialist. So if you want a very full, transparent view, which might be uncomfortable to hear, but these conversations are important, because obviously both sides will hear uncomfortable things because they're not from their sides. My side is that the Zionist movement, the mass migrations of Jewish and Zionist peoples, shouldn't have happened in the 20th century without the consent of the Palestinians. Where this statement is misinterpreted or taken too far by Palestinians today is that it translates to, therefore, all Jews today or all Zionists today in that land need to leave, or they need to be killed, or they need to be punished. That's not what that means. What that means is that we need to acknowledge the rights of Palestinians within this colonial framework. And I believe that shouldn't have happened, but in the modern day world, it's not fair to demand someone who was born there to leave, to be expelled. I'm not going to support that, right? I'm definitely not going to support the expulsion of someone from where they are. So, but That's where these sentiments translate into the right of the return of Palestinian refugees. That's where they translate into a feeling that there needs to be corrective justice paid by one side to the other. And that's also how we need to understand a lot of Palestinian response is that it's a response. When some people have said that Palestinians have instigated this, it's worth remembering that that's not the instigation. That's a response to the arrival of a people against the will of those indigenous people, right? And that doesn't negate that the Zionists who arrived there wanted to feel safe, wanted to feel that they deserved a home. There are two sides of one coin, and we don't need to, set this up as a dichotomy between two sides. They can be reconciled. The second thing is a very specific point, right? It's not as big. It's just a very specific correction. It's about the Mufti of Jerusalem, who you mentioned. He did seek to ally himself with Germany, right, in the late 30s and the 40s, Nazi Germany. But what that often translates to is that therefore he himself was Nazi, or therefore he himself was anti-Semitic. We don't call Italy as a Nazi. We don't call Japan as a Nazi. And in fact, something that's not brought to light is that actually before the Grand Mufti allied himself with Nazi Germany, many Zionist leaders actually sought to do that themselves. Why? Because they saw it as a way of siding against Imperial Britain. And that's the same way the Grand Mufti, I almost use Palestinians. He doesn't represent Palestinians. But that's the way the Grand Mufti wanted to ally himself with Nazi Germany. It wasn't because he adhered to Nazism. It wasn't because he necessarily was anti-Semitic, but because, like the Zionists, who previously tried to ally themselves with Nazi Germany, they wanted to impose the imperial power, Britain, who had imposed herself on that land. And it's just that narrative of the Grand Mufti and how often it's misused as a justification for the injustices against Palestinians because they were anti-Semitic. It's just that's problematic, and we need to kind of correct how that part of history is viewed.
So I think it's beautiful that we've both conditioned ourselves to be able to not get triggered on things that might be very offensive. And I think it's something that takes a lot of time to develop. It's something that we have to all work on ourselves on. And there are plenty that in the last segment of what you said that I disagree with, that I'm going to touch on. But because I've been able to grow, and I still have a lot to grow with in my process, because I've been able to see as like, look, the only way we're going to move forward is to have these tough conversations and not get triggered right away and be able to understand what each other is saying. I understand a lot of what you're saying. However, I do have to also give our narrative, our perspective, in order for us to find that greater truth, which includes both truths. So you mentioned Deir Yassin. Now, in Deir Yassin, it was a tragedy what happened because a thriving community that was rather large was completely displaced. However, there's context to that tragedy. There were militants that were fighting Jewish villages and that fled to that village. And there was conflicts between the two militant groups, and eventually people got kicked out and casualties of war that were killed in between. But it's not that the Jewish people went and found women and children and just shot them up. Of course, there are individuals that are evil on both sides, but to descript the Jews as a whole, as a force, or even like the Gun. No, I know that you didn't do it. I'm just adding
but just before you continue, that's why I mentioned earlier the terminology. Jews and Zionists, they're not interchangeable. They mean very different things.
But even Zionists, there's so many different types of Zionists. There's secular Zionists, religious Zionists, left-wing Zionists. So even that term in itself, that's why what's important for, I think, the Palestinian side to understand is that when we say Zionist, when I identify as a Zionist, I only mean that the Jewish people have a right to live there. I don't mean that Palestinians should leave. I don't mean that we should be in war. I'm not even thinking about Palestinians when I'm talking about Zionism. Yeah. I'm thinking about Palestinians when it's talking about now what do we create a civilization together. There weren't only massacres in the Arab world, even locally within Israel, within the British Mandate of Palestine, there were massacres. The Hebron massacre, which was actually, supported by and and led for the most part by the Grand Mufti. So I'll touch on the Grand Mufti a little bit later. But I think the term Zionist and Palestinian are these two terms that we so much identify with. You know, it's such an inherent part of who we are, but we see them as like the enemies of our story. And a lot of Israelis and Jews hear the word Palestinian and right away it's like, that's the enemy. That's the bad guy in the movie that I live in. That's the terrorist. That's the guy coming and wanting to kill me. And that's
the guy
not
with a
the truth.
mustache with an evil laugh.
Right, or with that suicide bomber, or someone that was trying to stop. And that's not true, because this term, if you really meet Palestinians, it's just defining their identity. And I think that's the same thing a little bit happening with Israeli and Zionist, is whenever a lot of Palestinians hear Israeli or Zionist, they turn into what they were taught is Zionism, what they were taught Jews see themselves as or see Zionism as. And I think that's why this conversation is to break down those walls, is when we say Zionism, it's not what necessarily the other side was taught that we mean by Zionism or see Zionism. When it comes to the British, I think we're on the same page. I do have to address the settler colonial part and the comparison with America, because when it comes to America, the indigenous peoples were the Native Americans and the foreigners were the British people that were living there, and then the Spanish and all sorts of different populations that had moved from Europe into the land of the First Nations. The Jews, however, came from the land before that. So it's not comparable in the situations. You know, it's more, I think it's really our situation is really unique in history, and there's not really many comparisons. But I think something that's a little bit closer is as if, okay, Tibet was a civilization. The Chinese people come and destroy Tibet. Let's say eventually China falls, like the Roman Empire falls. Different empires come and control Tibet. Then populations move in. The new population calls themselves X. The Tibetans still seek to one day return. They return back, and now there's a clash between the populations. I think that's more of a representation of the issue and less like the foreigners coming, because yes, we were born in foreign lands, but historically we don't come from foreign lands. The same way Palestinians, you wouldn't argue that, you know, Palestinians born outside of Israel shouldn't have the right to come back into Israel, the British mandated Palestinian land. We shouldn't argue that the same thing, that the Jews that were displaced shouldn't have a right to come back. So I think when we talk about settler colonialism, by nature, it implies a foreign power and not connecting any which way this people's rights to even live there. So I don't think it's settler colonialism. I do think that the experience may have been settler colonialism, but not because of settler colonialism, but because the dichotomy and one versus the other setup that the British waged. They really psychologically taught the Jews that the Palestinians and the local Arabs and the surrounding Arab countries want your destruction and don't want you to live there. And that's why I think they empowered people like the Grand Mufti, because they knew that this person would speak on behalf of the Palestinians, but not really represent the Palestinians. And that's what the Jews would hear. And so if that's what we hear, that's what the Palestinians want. And then they're coming and the British are telling the Palestinians another story. And we really were psychologically turned against each other. So that's my point on settler colonialism. We can disagree about how to call it, but in my opinion, settler colonialism is fundamentally about foreigners, and the Jews are not foreigners the same way that Palestinians, now born outside 2-3 generations, are not foreigners. They historically also come from this region. They are our cousins. I mean, genetically, culturally, historically,
from the Canaanites.
we're like such similar people. So you know, that's in terms of that, and I think it's more about ethnic conflict of two ethnic populations that are from this region fighting each other, not understanding each other, than about foreigners coming and imposing different things. And I think as long as we see like this, if you're pro-Palestinian, you must be anti-Zionist, and if you're pro-Zionist, you must be anti-Palestinian, it will continue. Just to finish on the Grand Mufti, he was vehemently anti-Semitic in his writings and the things that he said. And I'm not saying he's anti-Semitic because of him meeting with Hitler. Now, again, you're saying that the Zionists met with the Nazi Party. The Zionists met with the Nazi Party before they did what they did to the Jews in order to find a way to get the Jews out of there. The Grand Mufti met with Hitler after and during what he was already doing. So again, I never said, and I don't want people to understand that the Grand Mufti represents the Palestinians. And and if someone says I'll stand and fight with you, that if someone uses the Grand Mufti as an excuse for what happened, or as an excuse to do something, or an excuse to identify, I'm completely against it. There's no justification for injustices. There's understanding, and in hindsight, we're all geniuses. In those moments, we didn't have communication like we do today. We didn't have the ability to understand one another, and I think we do now, and we need to use that communication and ability to transcend the conflict in order to build a better reality.
Adar, I know you want to say something. I just want to. All right, go. I would.
Okay. Just to put clarity on this point. Yeah, if you look at the technical definition of colonizers, Jews do not fit that script because we were not a colony of any nation. We just weren't. It's not like Germany sent us here or England. Nobody sent us here to colonize. We came here. That being so, I would tell you it's just an uphill battle to try to make the colonizer claim. That being said, you do not need to be a colonizer to commit an injustice, right? So Jews do not need to be colonizers in order to have done wrong. Mm-hmm. So I would say this is just a better way to approach it, because we're not getting caught up in definition. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah. So a few small points before I respond to a larger one. So you're definitely right. You made a good distinction. I'm not actually defending the Grand Mufti and debating whether he was anti-Semitic or not. What I'm debating was, is he a Nazi or an anti-Semite for meeting with Hitler? No. Yeah, exactly. So we both have that common ground. We agree on that. And we agree that there is a misuse of his meeting with Nazi for, a certain agenda or a certain justification. And we have that agreement right now. I do have to contest one thing. I don't want to turn this into a historical debate, so we can agree to disagree at the end of this, also because there are more important issues. If you're under the assumption from what the sources you've read that the Zionist leaders met with the Nazi party in Nazi Germany to mitigate or stop or talk them out of the persecution of Jews or their demonization, then maybe that's what you've read. However, from what my sources are, they sought a political alliance between Nazi Germany and the Zionist leader in the mandate of Palestine to remove British influence there. So it way transcends the mitigation or stopping of the Jewish suffering that the Nazis eventually brought on and killed in one of the most horrific historical events in the modern era. Also, I do have to, I'm afraid I will have to be nitpicky about the settler colonialist movement. See, now what you brought up about the distinction between America and the Zionists is a fair distinction, in that the Zionists do believe they have a historical link to that homeland, that they originally came from there. The Americans obviously did not. But what at play is the same thing, is that for one reason or another, both movements believed they had some right to this land, right? A lot of the British colonialists believed they had a Christian right to preach, to spread their religion, regardless of what. Now, we both agree that's illegitimate. Where we disagree is the legitimacy of the motives Zionists came with. And you know what? I don't want to address that. What's important here are the actions that took place. The Zionists, when they came, they demanded an exclusive share to that land, right? They demanded an exclusive part of it to be Jewish. And they did it against the will of the people there. Regardless, and I believe that even, let's say, there is a legitimate right to Jews as an entire people to be a nation in that land, in the early 20th century, I believe that doesn't mean that there get to be mass movements against the will of the people who have lived there for centuries. And it's especially the people who haven't actually committed these atrocities against the Jews. They weren't the ones who kicked them out of this land 2,000, 3,000 years ago. However, unfortunately, it was a lot of militias and Zionist leaders who expelled the Palestinians from there. And so that's where the idea of corrective justice comes in. And that's why, Adar, I do have to disagree with you on the role that colonialism plays when it comes to injustices. It's not just that injustices were committed, it's that they were committed by a colonial power, and therefore there needs to be corrective justice in place. And it's also important to understand why many Palestinian factions and groups have done the actions they did. It's because they viewed it ultimately as a response to a colonial movement, and in the dreams of liberating this land from a movement that maintains what they believe to be a Jewish exclusive or Jewish majority movement. And I don't believe I'll be able to change your minds right now in this discussion, especially when it's something that where our identities come into play so strongly, so powerfully. Rudy, look at what you're wearing around your neck and look at what I'm wearing. That's the extent of which we hold our beliefs and our identities to such a high level. And that's why I'm not going to try to change your minds on this. All I'm going to try to say is that once you understand that Palestinians believe this is a colonial movement, regardless of whether you think it is, their actions become much more better understood, and a barrier drops, and it makes it easier to achieve justice. And also, because we don't want double standards here, and this goes the other way, when Palestinians also understand that Zionists didn't come here because they hated Palestinians, they hated Arabs, they wanted to kill them, but that because they felt a historical connection, and that they felt that creating a homeland here was the way to escape the injustice, the persecution, and the unsafety many of them felt back in Europe, back in Morocco, back in the United States, then another barrier drops. I want to just, before I give the floor back to either Adar or Rudy, I just want to remember if there is anything else I do want to mention. Yeah, it's, I guess, just another question. So do you believe, and this goes to either one of you, but Rudy mainly because he discussed this before, back to the idea for what it means to be a Jewish state. Do you believe that the idea of being a Jewish state stands in the way of a one-state solution? Because that's something that, frankly, I haven't really heard an answer about, or people discussing it. And I know it's also something debated amongst Israelis, amongst Zionists.
Yeah, so Rudy, I'll give it to you. I just want to make one more point on the colonizers. So, Sayf, just so you understand, I'm actually okay if you call Jews colonizers. Me personally, it doesn't offend. But just by definition, Jews don't fit that definition. So I'm giving you a suggestion in how to have a more productive conversation with Israelis, because the second you call them colonizers, they're going to get defensive and start arguing with you about definition. So what I would suggest is, let's find a way to talk about the injustices caused to the Palestinians by the early settlers without using a term that's just going to A, offend, and B, create debate. And it's actually a losing debate, because all you need to do is read the dictionary definition. We were not sent by another country. We're not a colony of another country. So we just don't fit the definition. So let's find another. We're just going to have a more productive conversation. So just a suggestion.
Would you speak, or could I respond?
Response, you might, I think, agree with a little bit more. And then maybe if you don't, you can Jewish state for all inhabitants of the land, to create a civilization for all for Jews, meaning we need to kick out, for the most part, Zionism, which is that existed here as well. And that majority of Israelis believe in functions for both. In Israel, 18% of that being Muslim Arab place, because there was just not happening ethnically in those areas. British had not planted the seed in our mind, no one would have been displaced. No Jews would have been displaced, and no Palestinian would have been displaced. So when we say group, We never were, and that's really what we see it as. We don't see it as anything else. So when we say the Zionists, okay, it might be this militia group or this paramilitary group or this leader or this time or this action, but it's not the Zionist, because then you're sort of putting what I represent and what all Zionists represents as Zionism under the umbrella of what you see as something negative, which we might actually side with you and recognize. And it prevents those barriers from being able to recognize by identifying. I definitely believe in corrective justice. And there's a lot of corrective justice that has to happen for the Palestinians and for the Israelis and for all populations in the Middle East and all populations of the world. However, I'm going to have to push a little bit back with Adar. The same way I ideologically fight against people that call Palestinians terrorists, that call Palestinians evil, that call Palestinians anything you want. Yeah, there were some that were terrorists. Yeah, the experience of most Israelis is that Palestinians are terrorists because there's a wall between us and we don't really see Palestinians. We don't experience Palestinians. So the Palestinians that many Israelis experience are those that are terrorists. And the media does a tremendous job to make us both on both sides see ourselves as the enemy of each other's stories. And Adar, it hits the nail on the point when you define the Jews as the colonialists. And you might not agree now, you might not agree ever, but I'd like for you to take this under consideration, that it automatically puts us in a position where we can't find common ground. The same way I think you would take the position that if I said, well, I'll agree with you, Sayf, we can find a way, but you have to agree with me that Palestinians are terrorists. You would say, well, we can't really move anywhere from there if you identify all of us by one brush that doesn't depict our population. That's sort of the same thing that we feel with the term colonialist and colonialism, of being foreigners, not native people, of being sent by a different country to create a colony, which Britain actually limited a lot of the Jews coming here. So, we were very much so against the British. The Jewish narrative, the Israeli narrative, the Zionist narrative is very anti-British. 1948 for us, by the way, is not like when we celebrate Independence Day, it's not the destruction of Palestinian villages. It's not the war that we won against the Arab. It's the remembrance that we kicked the British out. That's what we see it as. So the wars that came after is more ethnic conflict, but we really see the British as a problem that existed here and that caused everything after that. So that's when it comes to colonialism. We might not agree, but I think what you touch on is so important, that this is how the Palestinians experience you. Even if you may not be it, this is how we see it, and that's why we respond. And this is so important for Jews, Zionists, and Israelis to understand that terrorism is an anti-colonial tactic. Now, there are different ways of using terrorism. You can use terrorism, ideologically, verbally, physically. You can attack a military group. You can attack civilians. Jews use terrorism against the British. Now, we didn't attack the civilians. We attacked the British. Terrorism is an anti-colonial tactic, and that is why the Palestinians are doing that to Israelis, because they truly believe that if we are going to shake them off, to force them off, they're eventually going to leave. However, when you use an anti-colonial tactics onto a native population that just so happens to be 10 times stronger, they respond 10 times stronger. And I think that's the narrative that we need to break out. We need to stop seeing the Jews as colonialists. Not talking about the experience. The Palestinians still can experience what they went through and talk about what they went through and fix what they went through. But if we still see this character in this story as fundamentally evil, fundamentally foreign, fundamentally did something wrong in order to get here, then there's no way to fix things. The same way if a lot of Jews see Palestinians fundamentally evil, fundamentally not from here, fundamentally again, there's no way to fix things. So I think that's something that we both need to understand, that the reason why a lot of Palestinians are anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, sometimes even become anti-Jewish because of their experience, is because their experience with how they perceive the Jews as colonialists. And I fully agree with you on that. And that really goes to the next point of, you're asking me about a Jewish state and a one-state solution, which is what Adar wanted to focus on about future conversations. You're going to be surprised. I don't know if you've seen some of the things that I've said or if you've heard someone else say it, but I believe in one civilization, and I don't think that contradicts a Jewish state, because when we say a Jewish state, it's not talking about majorities. This concept of majorities is a very Western concept. Like, we should run ourselves locally, not yes, we should have domestic representation, but we need more local power. That's how Middle Easterns live. Either there's a family member that runs that family, which is the leading family of the tribe, or there's a representative that is democratically elected that represents the community. We need to create a system that exists that allows both populations, and maybe there's two forms of governments, like bodies. I mean, like one is the Knesset and one is another form of body with different regions, and we're federations and we're one civilization where everyone can live equally, everyone can travel equally, everyone can have economic opportunities and resources and all that stuff. We all feel the part of the same civilization, and it's Jewish enough for Jews to believe we live in a Jewish state and to experience it, and Palestinian enough for Palestinians to experience it and believe there's a Palestinian state. That is the future solution that I believe in, and I don't believe that contradicts with it being a Jewish state. And when we're talking about exclusive Jewish state, we don't mean exclusive Jewish state by there shouldn't be Palestinians here or the majorities. We mean it by we just want the Jews to be able to self-determine here in a way that we need, which doesn't contradict with the way that Palestinians need. And that's actually, you know, it's something that we've experienced for our generation. Even in the Quran and the Torah, the two sons of Abraham, Ishmael and Yitzhak, are our ancestors, you know, were at war their whole lives. But at some point they made peace. And it was actually the death of Abraham that brought them together. So a more, you know, a question that I always ask myself, very philosophical question, is what is the death of Abraham in this generation that would allow the brothers to return, the brothers to reunite, and the brothers to create a civilization together? And I don't have the answer to that. But maybe it's this concept that we must oppose one another and that we can't understand each other's experiences and validate each other's identity.
Adar, do you want to say something?
Yeah, one thing that I think will just lead us into the next topic, which is just talking about like present solutions, and then I do want to take some questions from the audience. You know, this is the kind of discussion that could go on for days, months, and even years. There's just so much to cover. Somebody asked in the comments, and I know many people are wondering why I'm okay. You know, I said I'm okay if you call Jews colonizers, and this is why, to anybody who's wondering, whether we're considered colonizers or not, to me, it doesn't make any difference to the injustices caused. So sure, it's a label, but the injustices are still the injustices. And that being said, those injustices say absolutely nothing to whether we have a right to live here today or not. None of us living here today are guilty for the injustices caused in the past. So I view it as an issue of semantics. It doesn't offend me. I think it's by definition incorrect, and I definitely can understand if people are offended by it, but that's just personally how I view things. Because I do like to view things in present tense. Two populations live here. We share this land. We need and just by virtue of us living here, we both have a right to live here. That's how I view things. So I think, you know, let this be the way in which we start talking about the present, because I think that's really the most important. Would you guys agree that just the fact that we're both living here together is really what gives us, more than anything, even the right to live here? If neither of you guys want to take that question, that's fine.
Sayf, I think, wanted to answer the previous point and then answer maybe this question, and it can lead into further.
I think what you and I, Rudy, we really managed to get to the heart of this, that we may disagree on what actually happened, right? I staunchly believe Zionism cannot be divorced from its colonial nature. You believe it can, and we're not going to argue that right now because we've seen how unproductively these discussions go, but we can both accept that definitely both sides, both peoples, and it shouldn't be both sides, as we've said before, right? That's a way of framing this conflict as a zero-sum game where one benefits, the other loses. And that's a frame that we've experienced for decades, and it's not ever going to be resolved that way. If some people lose, then that's not a victory. But we definitely got at the heart of that's what people experience, right? A lot of Israelis, what they experience from Palestinians are violent attacks, are hatred. And what a lot of Palestinians experience from their Israelis is the IDF soldier who holds a gun, patrolling their neighbors or raids their house. And it's definitely the fact that many people from all sides invalidate these perspectives because they don't agree with them. And if you invalidate an entire worldview, then you're never going to be able to reconcile. You're never going to pave this path to peace and correcting injustices from whichever side. And we definitely know that it's possible to resolve. As for also, I'm very glad to hear that we also share another common ground, which is this one-state solution, this idea of a civilization, that regardless of what happened, that doesn't define of what will happen. There can be one civilization where everyone here, whether they're Jewish, Arab, Muslim, Palestinian, they can all have a right to all that land. They can be equal, they can cooperate, and they can learn from each other's experience and forge even a new identity. Because as we said, identities evolve, and identities don't necessarily have to contradict one another. When you gain one, you don't necessarily discard one. So this civilization, it can be as Jewish as it can be Palestinian. It can be Jewish for some and Palestinian for others. And the fact that it is Palestinian doesn't mean it's not Jewish. And the fact that it is Jewish doesn't mean it's not Palestinian. Mm-hmm. And to kind of respond to Adar, I won't be debating why I do believe the movement in the early 20th century did fit the definition of settler colonialism, because that's not what this debate is for. If this was a historical debate, then I'd definitely be open to that. But also, I think it's worth mentioning about your triggering thing and making things counterproductive when someone calls another a colonizer or et cetera, et cetera. I'm not calling you a colonizer. I'm not calling Rudy a colonizer. The same way that when Black people in the US fight for their rights and want to have their history acknowledged and their injustices corrected, they're not calling the white people in America the slave owners. They're not calling them the colonizers. They're not calling them the people responsible for the historic injustice of Black people. It's a very tough discussion to have. And I think what Rudy said is absolutely right. And it's something that all three of us here should be very proud of, that we're able to discuss things that can usually, trigger people from all sides. There have been battles and fights, physical fights, that have been, instigated at lesser things either of us have said right now over this Zoom call, right? So it's very impressive we're able to have these tough conversations, but that's what it is. It's tough. I'm not antagonizing or demonizing the Israelis or the Jews who live there right now, or the Zionists who live now, but I do believe that acknowledging the colonial aspects of Zionism and the movement that took place there, whether or not it represented all Zionists or all people who believed in that ideology, like Rudy said, it is a part of it, and it does need to be acknowledged the same way white people can acknowledge the historic dynamics between their peoples to try and correct the injustices and move forwards, without necessarily meaning that they are any less or they are any worse. It's not a reflection of them, but rather the perception other people have of them. And that needs to be acknowledged. And yeah.
I don't want to get stuck on this. Look, I agree with you that we need to acknowledge injustices. I just think it's a tactical error on your part to try to use a term that is that's it's going to be hard for you to win that argument, because what nation are we a colony of when we came here?
All right. Well, I thought you said you didn't want to get into this debate.
Well,
if
yeah,
you do,
I think we shouldn't. I
was just straight, because for me it's very important. I love productive conversation. So there's certain narratives that I see them as counterproductive. So it might seem like I'm a stickler, but I do this for the sake of breaking down narratives that I see as counterproductive. You mentioned, Black Americans. It's true that, they could talk about the injustices and white people acknowledge that they're not slave owners, but there is a narrative amongst many Black Americans. It's still a small minority, thankfully, but they say all white people are racist. I would tell those Black Americans the same thing I would tell you. You are essentially changing the definition of racist in order to fit this narrative, and you're not going to get enough people to agree. So let's find a definition that actually works and that can actually build a broader alliance. So, you know, I recommend the same thing to Black Americans, and I'm recommending the same thing to you. We should use terminology that we won't get stuck on the actual term, and so we could actually make progress. Because you could convince Jews that injustices occurred by Jews towards Palestinians way easier than you're going to convince them that it was a colony. So I just don't want you to get stuck on this, but we have spoken about it enough. I am happy to move on. If you want, you can.
I just want to make a closing point. Sayf, you don't have to agree with us. You know, you are a free person, you are our cousin, and you will have your opinion, whatever it is. But just take into consideration that we can accept that Palestinians view their experience as colonialism, use terrorism as a form of anti-colonialism, view Zionism as that, and have experienced it in their perspective as that. But when you tell us that we're colonialist, you're telling us that our intentions were to remove people, which it wasn't, that we were brought by, and it just gets into a conversation where it prevents us, I think, from being able to transcend. So we don't have to agree on if this term is the term that is correct or not. I think that the conversation we're having about talking about the future is way more important, and we don't have much time. So I think we should focus on that. But take it as, like, you know, you heard our perspective that this is not necessarily the best term that could be used to describe us, because there's going to be a lot of friction to it. You might disagree, but that's our perspective.
I respect both of your opinions and respect both of what you said. And I definitely understand that it's coming from a well-intentioned place of where all three of us want productive discussion, and all three of us are tired of the shackles of old narratives and old dichotomies. And I respect that all three of us here want to build a better future. And as it turns out, we even share a vision for what that future looks like in a single, unified, diverse civilization. All I'll say is I do believe we might have different ideas of how this productive discussion looks like. I understand that for both of you, it comes from a place of not wanting to attack an entire people or antagonize them. And I respect that. In my view, it's just that I do believe there are some harsh truths that need to be acknowledged. And that's my closing statement. I'm not going to try to debate what it was right now, because as you said, that's not what our discussion is, and there are more important things to discuss. But I respect that all three of us are doing it. We're all trying to reach the same intention, only thinking that there are different ways of achieving that. And yeah, that's a closing statement on it.
So I want to ask Sayf a question. You know, in the way that I grew up, I was never conditioned or taught to hate Palestinians or Arabs. Although I grew up knowing that there's constant wars, and living in Israel when I was young, and being in Israel in the summers and going to bomb shelters, I never saw the collective of Arabs and Palestinians as my enemies. But there are certain things that I was conditioned to that I was able to disconnect. For example, your kafia, right? I was conditioned to see that as a negative symbol. I was conditioned to see that right away and be like, oh, that's my enemy. Because I didn't necessarily see it as that's Palestinian. I didn't necessarily see that as that's Arab. I saw that as those are the people wearing that, or the people that want my destruction. And now when I see you wearing it, you're not my enemy. You're actually a part of me that needs to come and create one thing over here. You're not, I don't even think Israelis and Palestinians are allies. Like, we can be allied with another country. We are the same population and are together as one. So I don't see those things, and I've been able to grow out of that with time, and I think many people will be able to grow out of those things with time as well. So my question is, as someone who's so enlightened as you, and it's really a pleasure to be having this conversation with you, how do you think from your community you will be able to communicate to them the conclusions and understandings that you have? There's so much conversations around anti-normalization, not being able to talk with Jews and with Israelis and with Zionists, and there's no conversation until there's justice. But the reality, like we both know, is there's no zero-sum game. So the justice will come from both of us, and the way we understand is by humanization and understanding. So how do you think you approach that situation? How do you see it moving forward for your population?
So those two questions about, the things different people get conditioned to learn, how you perceive it as you grow and become more aware and get a more diverse perspective on things, and also on the way moving forward and in terms of normalization. So when I grew up, it's the big problem that I see, that is the reason that I've even mentioned it, is just how interchangeable Israeli, Zionist, and Jew were in the daily terminology of the people in my environment. It was a very antagonizing position. It was the view that these Zionists were foreigners and that they hated Arabs and that they just wanted to kill Arabs and kick them out of their homes, and we need to find a way forward, whether it's fighting back or if we can get them to accept a solution. But there was also a feeling of frustration that they felt that this other side wasn't really looking for a solution. And there also was anti-Semitism. There is anti-Semitism amongst Arab societies, and that's a problem, and I definitely acknowledge it, and I try to solve it. And I even remember a few years ago, it was Eid. For those who don't know, Eid is one of the holiest holidays for Muslims, and it followed the holy month of Ramadan. And it's a very communal time, and families visit each other and spend so much time with each other. So I was with my extended family, including my great uncle, who was kicked out of his home back in the 30s or 40s. And he mentioned something about how the Jews were to blame and how our enemies were the Jews. And I told him, no, the Jews are diverse people. They have their traditions, they have their customs. They're not a political group, they're not a military, and they're not one country or one nationality. You can't lump them in together, and they're not supposed to be our enemies. We share common interests, we acknowledge common injustices. If you want an enemy, it's the people standing in the way of injustice. It's the people who support the military occupation, who support the mistreatment of Palestinians because they're Palestinian. And it's the people who discriminate against people for being Palestinian, no matter their political ideology or ethnicity. So there's that. And as I've grown older, I've been wanting to distance myself from the interchangeability of these terms, which I believe leads to a lot of confusion and a lot of hate that is not correctly expressed, although it might come from legitimate sadness and frustration, but the way it's expressed is not okay and it should be rejected. Now, as for, could you remind me of your second question, please?
Yeah, it's more so how, I'm sure you've had these conversations with many of your peers, your family members. So I guess, how have people responded to it? And how do you think you, as a leader, I think you are and you will be for your people, how do you think you will be able to change that mindset from this, one versus the other narrative, which I also fight to change that within the Israeli civilization and population? How do you think you'll be able to do that? Like, what is the process? What have you been able to realize and understand? Sort of walk me through your experience and your vision.
I think definitely one side of that is also continuing to battle anti-Semitism, or even the view of it as a Jewish versus Palestinian thing. And there's also another thing, which is that a lot of people perceive this conflict to be a religious conflict. And I mean Arab, I mean Westerner, and I mean Jewish here. It's sort of seen as Islam versus Judaism. And the problem with the religious conflict is it's going to be a conflict. It tends to be a zero-sum game. And that's not the game we want to play. That's not the game we want to engage in or even acknowledge. And so it's definitely changing the framing of that, the way we perceive that. It's not that it's not that the only way Palestine can be free is when these people get kicked out. It's not that Palestinians can only get self-determination when these people lose. So that's how it is from my view. And it's also from the view that we need to create cross-community alliances. And I think that's great when you see certain Jewish organizations who acknowledge the injustice of the Palestinians, right? Who acknowledge their suffering and advocate for an alliance between Zionists or Jews and Palestinians. But there's also the media aspect, which is that it's almost becoming a part of being Palestinian, a part of the identity, which is the feeling of voicelessness. And I understand this is something Jews definitely relate to, understand, and in your words, is even a part of the identity for many. It's the feeling of voicelessness and powerlessness. When people feel frustrated, voiceless, and powerless, they tend to go to unjustified, hateful, or unproductive things. Unfortunately, that means becoming anti-Semitic, adopting anti-Semitic views. That means embracing violent means, which, though I do not demonize these means because I view them as an anti-colonial response, I do acknowledge there are better ways for all people, all these parties involved, to achieve this peace, to achieve a way forward, and that's without violence. And it's also electing better leaders and holding those leaders to account. Now, one issue is when someone mentions Mahmoud Abbas, right, who even Palestinians make fun of by calling Abu Mazen, right? It's a joke to us. He's frankly a joke to us. We do not consider him a leader. He is deeply unpopular, and for many reasons, right? But unfortunately, the Palestinian Authority is a very corrupt body. It's a very corrupt organization, and it does not represent Palestinian people. And it's a very hard struggle. It's very tough, and it's one that unfortunately we see all too often fail around the world, but the Palestinian people need to hold him to account. Is that going to be easy? No. Is that going to take time? Yes. Will there be a price to pay when a people try to hold corrupt leaders to account? Yes. And so I advocate that yes, Israel is still committing injustices against us fellow Palestinians, my brothers and sisters. But if the first step is to at least elect leaders who can open a dialogue with this other side, who can represent your interests better, and then we can move on to these bigger aspirations. As long as this first step isn't taken, as long as the people who are speaking on our behalf aren't actually representing us, then there's not going to be peace, right? There's just not going to be that. And so from my perspective, that's what I'm going to do. The last thing I'm going to do is, honestly, I'm going to try and discourage people from this two-state solution. I believe neither side will benefit, right? And I think the two-state solution, and this is my opinion on it, from both Zionist supporters of it and Palestinian supporters of it, I think it comes from a place of fear. I think it comes from a place of distrust. The Palestinians want their own Palestinian state because they don't trust the Zionists. And the Zionists want a two-state solution because they don't trust the Palestinians. They don't trust the Arabs. And both sides might have legitimate reasons, right? It didn't just come out of nowhere. It's from their own experiences, regardless of whether that's one-sided, but we need to understand that there is that side. But we need to acknowledge that this comes from a place of fear. And when people act out of fear, act of distrust, nothing good will come out of it. And I hope to push the one-state solution to become a more acceptable and more mainstream view to further the solution we're talking about.
So I think
Rudy, real quick before you respond. So we're already past the 2-hour mark. So Rudy, after you respond, I'd like to go to questions. I normally will never ask this of you, but try to not make your response super controversial, because then Sayf will feel the need.
Oh, no, not at all. To the
Yeah, yeah.
contrary.
And guys, just one more thing. So we obviously did not touch on all the topics we would have liked to. That's the nature of how complex this conflict is. If you guys are both willing, I'd like to do a round two with both of you, because I think that you guys have had great productive dialogue and found common ground. Not only found common ground, initially had common ground, and found common ground on many topics. So I'd love to schedule another one. To everybody viewing, you could start asking the questions in the chat. Also, I linked all of Rudy's social media channels in the description of the video, as well as Sayf's, as well as mine. Feel free to connect with any of us. We're all happy to engage in dialogue. If you guys like this content, please subscribe. I do things weekly. Next Thursday, the date's not final, but I'm working on it. There's going to be a live debate between a Black Lives Matter activist and a Black conservative. So that's going to be interesting. And so that's it, Rudy, all you, and then we'll go to questions.
Yeah. Again, I keep saying like how amazing this conversation is, because for us, it might be for you too. It's very unique. Most Palestinian activists that I engage with, it's yes, they care about Palestinians and they fight for Palestinians, but they're not able to get to this level of transcendence of not seeing me as the enemy. And that's what like is so beautiful about this, that we're not agreeing on everything. We're being completely respectful to each other. We actually see each other as family, and we're talking about building a reality that includes both of those families into one. I completely am against a two-state solution. I think it's actually a racist solution that has to, you go over there, we go over there, we can't live together. I'm completely against it. I think any conversation of a two-state solution is wasting time of potential real solutions that can occur, that can actually transcend the conflict. And you're right that a lot of people have this solution from a place of fear. We can't live with them, so they go there. We can't live with them, so they go there, and we'll be fine. But that doesn't end the injustices for either. Will not find peace for either, and will not fulfill the aspirations for either. Palestinians need to be able to live or travel to or go whenever they want to Akko and to Yafo, and Jews need to be able to go to Shem and to Bethlehem and to all these places as well. And we need to have, ability to travel and to move wherever we want. And I think you touched on a point about Abu Mazen that a lot of Jews can't really understand, that he doesn't represent Palestinians. And so many times when I'm having conversations with like more right-wing Jews or Jews that have not yet heard the nuance of the Palestinian experience, like, well, maybe if the Palestinians were nice, or maybe if the Palestinians want peace, but look, we offered them peace all these times, and we did this and we did that. And I was like, who was at the table? Who was negotiating? Who was representing them? Not the Palestinian people. Abu Mazen and individuals that were not elected, and individuals that are basically hoarding the power and profiting from this conflict. All these leaders in the PA and even many in Hamas have millions of dollars in their account. And I often make the joke, it's not because they invested in Bitcoin at the right time, it's because they took the money that was supposed to go to the Palestinians. So, this is something that a lot of the Zionists and the Jews that are listening to this talk, and that will listen to the talk, understand that the actions of the PLO and Hamas do not represent the Palestinians. And we have to be able to disconnect them in order to be able to build a reality with our Palestinians. I just have one small detail question to you. In your experience, when you're doing this to your community, what has been your experience and the reactions? Can you walk us through examples that you were able to, make someone understand, or some frictions that you've received from your community? Just walk us maybe along your experience with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, first off, before I answer your question, I also want to commend both of you, because I think I was surprised. Right. Well, I did watch some of your videos, but I wasn't sure what you believed about certain topics. I wasn't sure how you'd respond to certain topics. And I absolutely agree that there's a lot to play with. Do these leaders, do these people who hold power actually represent all the people they claim to represent, right? Because what many Palestinians have seen is Benjamin Netanyahu, and Benjamin Netanyahu's comments about Arabs being dogs, or being in a separated by a moral abyss. And what they think is that, well, that must represent everyone in Israel. And of course, as I've been learning recently, he's a very controversial figure amongst Israelis. There are many people who completely oppose him, although there are some people who support him. And this again goes back to, do we really have leaders who represent any of these people? Do we really have leaders who have the best interests of any of these people? And I also want to commend you for being able to acknowledge this other side. I have discussed this with many Zionists, with many Israelis before, but it was always framed as a zero-sum game, as two sides that must always be in conflict. And also, many people had different definitions of Zionism. I've heard some define it as one that can only have Jews, or that can only have a small threshold of non-Jews. And that's something I don't think I could ever ally myself with. Your take on it, your perspective, your acceptance of these other views, and your ability to create something that's veered from the mainstream of what many people perceive these different groups to be, I think is something very commendable. And the fact that you're even dedicating yourself to have these conversations as a figure is fantastic. Because for me, I learn more when I participate in these, and I'm sure many of the audience members who are watching this and previous videos have learned both from you and the person you are engaging with. So I really want to thank you for that. To answer your question about the friction we face within our communities, a lot of it is on this enemy narrative. It's, yes, they have committed injustices against Palestinians. Yes, still today, Palestinians suffer under Israeli rule. Does that mean we can only benefit when Israel loses? Does that mean we can only benefit when Israelis are hurt? No, and we need to fight against that narrative, because that's only going to make things worse for everyone involved. Also, surprisingly, it hasn't been hard to convince people of the one-state solution. I do believe in recent years it's definitely losing popularity, the two-state solution. People are seeing it either as, unaccomplishable, it's unachievable, it's just impractical today, or people are viewing it on the fact that, hey, even if we could do it, even if it was practical, do we really want to? Is that what we really want? Is that what's really fair for Palestinians and for everyone else? Is that really what's gonna make us happy and make the real people, the real stories? Because we mention abstract concepts sometimes, and we sometimes get rooted in them. Zionism, Palestine, colonialism, but it's really the real people, the human beings, the men, women, mothers, fathers who suffer under this, and we take them into account. Unfortunately, it depends, I guess, on the community. Having a dialogue with many activists who write, write articles, who spread news, who donate, who establish movements. I find discussions with them much easier, because as people with an actual stake in the conflict and who are very involved, they seem to have a more well-rounded point of things, because they try to engage with so many different sides for whatever reason. But when I speak to, for example, I visited a Palestinian refugee camp here in Jordan a few years ago. I was volunteering to help them and for some, socioeconomic benefits for them. And I managed to talk to them. It was interesting in that they felt there was no other option but to hate the Zionists. They referenced something that's made me learn something, is that in 1947, when the UN proposed the partition plan, there was actually another option on the table that the committee in charge decided not to even propose, which was the one-state solution. And he said, my community then actually wanted that one. We were willing to accept the Zionists who were on the land at that point, and we said, let's build one civilization together. Let's forget any bad history in the past few decades, and let's just move on and create one state where we're not saying this is Arab, that's Jewish, that's Palestinian, that's Zionist. It's just one thing. And they felt that their attempts to unite, their attempts to cooperate are all fruitless. They felt they weren't respected. They felt they weren't acknowledged. And they felt that they had to antagonize the other side because they were antagonized first. And so their grievances are legitimate. The issue is just, it's a very powerful and it's a very hard thing to tell someone who has been hurt by someone else that you don't need to hurt them back, that they don't have to be an enemy, that we can work together and there is another way, because this way clearly isn't working. So that's a lot where the friction comes.
Great. Can we?
Could I ask Rudy the question back, or is there a time issue?
I mean, we're already in two hours and 20 minutes, and people have a lot of questions. We won't be able to get to them. Rudy, you think you could give like a real quick response to Sayf's next question?
Yeah, I can answer very quickly. I mean, our experiences aren't that different from one another. Yeah, there's different historical points that, you know, we focus on and that the Palestinians focus on, and different narratives of the history and understandings of what happened in the orders and stuff like that. But we really view the conflict that's in a similar way. A lot of the Zionist community sees that, all right, Palestinians didn't want peace. They didn't want to live together. We accepted the partition plan, although I'm against the partition plan. I'm against the division of this land. I don't know why people accepted the Oslo Accords, why people accepted the partition plan. However, the narrative is like, even if ideologically we're against it, we still proposed it and they rejected it. And the way I see it is like, of course they rejected the partition plan. You should have rejected the partition plan too. And I think that the problem was that we never actually heard each other. We never actually spoke to one another, even then. Right? It's not just something that's happening now. We're even more so now not really talking to each other because now there are walls. Where then actually we're going into each other's villages and trading and buying in each other's markets. Now that we're not even able to really communicate and have human interaction. In my experience, most Zionists that I speak to, it takes a long and deep conversation. Sometimes it takes a few conversations, but for the most part, eventually they usually get it. They usually understand that we no longer have to see them as our enemies. It takes a lot to break down. You know, I have to emphasize, everything that you see a terrorist do, that terrorist is just as evil as you think. That doesn't represent all Palestinians. Everything that you've seen the PA do, the PA is as corrupt. And you know what? The Palestinians will actually agree with you on that. You know, everything that you actually see as, this is why I can't come together and understand and hear and accept the Palestinian story and identity, Palestinians probably will agree with you or see a version of that on their other side. And I think the biggest point that allows people to be able to understand and to open up is having them understand, listen, there are millions of us on both sides. There is no reality that can exist where either population will disappear. So if you truly care about your people more than the fight against the other, if you truly care about the people that you claim to be fighting for, you need to be able to create a reality that they exist in as well. And that doesn't mean giving up on your aspirations. Because a lot of people that are maybe more so on the left of Israel, again, I think this division of left and right is horrible, because the right cares about identity and security. It's important. The left talks about humanity and justice, important. Why do they contradict? But the people that identify more on the extreme left of Israel, you know, they kind of see the situation and are talking about it, but a lot of people on the right can't accept it. And the problem really is the inability to understand what each other wants and what each other truly needs to create. And that is the point that I've been trying to break down, and not only with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with the current situation in the Israeli society. And I think that's the problem we need to break down around the world. You were talking about the issue of it being something religious a little bit earlier. And, you know, in a way, Judaism can be seen as a form of Islam. Now, I know this is something controversial, and a lot of people that are Jewish and Zionists are like, well, what are you talking about? Well, Islam for Muslims means the submission to Hashem, the submission to Allah. It doesn't mean you have to follow the Quran. It means specifically the submission to this oneness. And the Jews submit to this oneness. So this issue is really not a religious issue. It's been an issue that is politicized because of interest. And to get back to the point, when I talk to my community, there are those that reject. There are those that even like the head of the JDL in Canada, you know, hates me because I accept that Palestinians exist and recognize their suffering. And so someone, you know, that's what's crazy is that the people that are on the extreme right and the extreme left hate me. And that's because they can't see a reality that both exist.
Yeah.
And they see it as either we give up on our aspirations or we destroy them. And I think we can have our aspirations and we don't need to destroy them. Not only we don't need to, we shouldn't. And their destruction means our destruction. So we need to create a reality for both. So that's in my experience.
Yeah, and I just want to say one disclaimer. I said it in the beginning of this conversation, but I don't represent Palestinians. I don't speak on behalf of all Palestinians. Many Palestinians will disagree with a lot of what I said. They will agree with a lot of what I said, but that's because these labels are just that. They're labels. Just because one Palestinian does, thinks, or says this, they're not one homogenous group. The same goes to Jews, the same goes to Israelis, the same goes to Arabs, the same goes for every other label that is put or given to any people around the world. It's just that, a label. So that's, yeah.
Great. So guys, we're going to do a hard stop in exactly 10 minutes from now, 10 p.m. Holy Land time. So I will request that we keep the responses as concise as possible. Let's try to keep audience responses to 1 minute. Sayf, the first question is for you. It's about Arab rejectionism. Many Jews are concerned that any peace proposal that's been put forth has been rejected. What would it take for Palestinians to accept a peace proposal?
Yeah, so I've heard this, of course, a lot. It's a very common talking point, and unfortunately, it's used oftentimes to, misportray Palestinians as a war-mongering people. Here's the thing: when someone offers you a deal and says, if you accept this deal, we can have peace, and you reject it, that doesn't mean you don't want peace. It's just that you don't accept peace on those conditions because you believe these are unjust or unfair or unrepresentative conditions. So like Rudy said, it's so often times like this narrative always begins with the 1947 partition plan. Palestinians and Arabs are antagonized for rejecting it. I would have rejected it. At that time, I absolutely would have. And Rudy and I have that common ground. We both agree that this land, when you say that this land has to be divided, what you're saying is these people can't coexist together. It's that these people hate each other. You're saying we can't have one country that isn't diverse or multicultural or where everyone has a right to all this land and to all these important cultural and heritage sites. There are important Jewish cultural sites, there are important Christian cultural sites, Muslim and Arab cultural sites. And when you divide it this way, you're telling one half, hey, you can't have the other. So I would have rejected that. And I will apply that similar approach to every single deal offered since. The Palestinians haven't rejected those deals because they want war, because they want conflict. It's simply because they were bad deals. Now, when someone says, well, what have the Palestinians proposed? There are numerous negotiations Palestinians have participated in and made their demands heard. One in the modern day is the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative. The Palestinians very clearly said what they believe. This would be a fair and just solution. And if this is achieved, they would accept peace. So what I'm saying is that when someone rejects a deal, it means they think it's a bad deal, not because they want peace. And actually, I think there's something else I want to talk about when we say peace. Peace is oftentimes described as the ultimate thing everyone wants or everyone should want, right? When you don't have peace, that's an inherent evil. That's just bad, objectively. What we often forget is that peace is a symptom. Peace should be the symptom of what we should be striving for. If there is peace, but in this peace there is injustice, that's not a peace worth accepting. And I'm not even just saying this within the context of, Palestine and Israel. I'm saying this within the context of everywhere else. Now, there are bad reasons to reject peace, but when you feel that accepting it would mean accepting injustice, unfairness, or brutalization, then that's a very fair reason to reject peace. After all, Britain offered peace multiple times, and both sides rejected it. Does that mean Britain here is the benevolent peacemaker and all the other parties are evil warmongers? Of course not. That's not what it is. So Palestinians are a people who want peace, as I'm sure are many Zionists and Israelis. It's just that everyone wants to accept that peace as long as they live in justice, they live with dignity, and they feel they can be safe. So whenever Palestinians have rejected that deal, it's because they felt those innate human desires, those just, basic human needs that every people deserve, including the Jewish people, weren't met. And I'm not going to enter this tiny pedantic debate of saying exactly why this deal was rejected or why that one was rejected, because we'd be here for a very long time.
All good. To summarize in one sentence, the deals have been rejected because the deals weren't good enough in your perspective.
Pretty much.
And that's actually something that Rudy agrees completely. That's a full agreement there. Rudy, this is a question, tricky, kind of controversial. How do we restore Jewish civilization and rebuild the third temple?
Well, to touch quickly on the previous point, I agree with Sayf. The thing is, what is really peace? Because peace represents a point of time where two or more parties are not in conflict. Peace will be achieved when you have justice, and you don't have peace until you have justice. Like, we can't describe a nonviolent continuation of the status quo until we change the status quo. So I completely agree with your point there. And again, I would have rejected the partition plan. And we have a saying actually in Jewish culture and in Jewish history of King Solomon having two mothers come and present a baby and both saying that this baby belongs to them. And King Solomon says, you know what, I'm going to cut the baby in half and you take one half and you take the other. And one mother says, fine. Another mother says, no, that's not my baby, it's her baby. And that's how King Solomon was able to see the true mother is the mother that's not willing to cut her child. And I think that's how we have to view this land. If we're willing to cut this land into two, then we shouldn't even be on this land in the first place. To answer the question about how do I see a Jewish civilization? Well, I mean, Israel is a Jewish civilization, but there are many things that aren't Jewish in the civilization that, aren't Palestinian either. Like the British parliamentary system that exists, the balance of power that the rabbinate has. Of course, there should be religious leaders, but for them to impose certain things and for it to be a sort of mafia when it comes to things being kosher and gets, and there's a lot of things that needs to change. And I think it's part of the conversation of decolonization. For so long, this land has been colonized by the Romans, the Byzantines, the Ottomans, the British, and now we need to unpack a civilization, create something better. And there's a whole conversation. Did the things that these colonizers bring into our civilization, do we want to keep them? Like, it could be good, right? They could have created something that is good for us to use. Do we want to keep it, or is it bad? Do we want to go back to what we had before? And I think that's something that we will accomplish as a generation of us together. And I don't think it's any job for any individual to impose. In terms of the Temple Mount, I'm fundamentally connected to that place. It's the holiest place for the Jewish people. It's not the Kotel. The Kotel is the wall outside of the holiest place of the Jewish people. But does that mean it can't be holy to someone else? Does that mean that someone else can't also be there? Does that mean, there's a system that exists in Ma'at HaMakhbala, in the patriarch's tomb in Hebron, where they have a sort of system as you guys have one side for one bit of time and we have one bit of time. I think there's a way to create something even better than that, where we can both be able to go there and to experience, our connection to oneness, which is very similar, and be able to fulfill our aspiration, religious needs that we have. And it's a conversation for the future. If we can find a way to no longer have the status quo of both populations suffering and the hatred that we have in each other's eyes, create a reality in a civilization where we both come together, I think the conversation of what to create in Jerusalem and in the Temple Mount will be something that's very easily solved.
Cool. Yeah. We could imagine it something like being a worship center of the children of Abraham and the monotheistic religions and the God of the monotheistic religions, something of that sort.
Yeah, I mean, the point of connecting to that place, which is so holy, is connecting to the oneness. And I said this earlier. Now, Islam was founded 1,500 years ago. But when someone says Islam, it's the submission to Allah, the submission to God, the submission to oneness. And that's why in Islam, Jews are allowed to stay Jews. They're not supposed to be converted to something else. They're supposed to keep the Torah. So there's a way for us religiously to accept each other's connection to this oneness and be able to fulfill who we are without being separated. So yeah, I don't know how exactly it's going to look like, what color the structure is, if it's going to be an additional structure added, enlarged. I don't know what future image it's going to have. And to be honest, it's not my job to impose that. I think it's something that we will be able to achieve, but there are things that are more important than the current Temple Mount, although it is something important for both populations. In order for us to get there, that's like the roof, right? You need the foundations, the communication and humanization. You need to build the walls, the structures, ending the injustices. And then when we finish all these things, we have the frame of our masterpiece and we have the roof on top of our homes.
So in short, Im tirtzu en zo agada, which translates to if you will it, no is a
if you will it, there is no dream.
If you will it, there is no dream. That doesn't make sense.
If you will it, it is no dream.
Oh,
like it's not just a dream and a hypothetical. It's something that can be accomplished. And that's like what Herzl was saying, that even though I have this crazy idea, if you will it, it is no dream. It's not just a hypothetical situation.
Cool. So guys, we're gonna wrap it up. Whoever did not get their questions answered, actually don't worry, because Rudy and Sayf's social media channels are in the description. So reach out to them. They would be very happy to answer your questions, as would I. I'm happy to speak to anybody. Feel free to reach out. And guys, yeah, thank you so much for your time. It's been a great pleasure. I look forward to seeing you guys back. We're going to do stuff like this every week, and I'd be very happy to have both Rudy and Sayf back. If you guys both want to really say one last minute, go for it.
Rudy, do you want to go first?
I mean, I think it was a beautiful conversation. We were able to understand each other. I gained a lot from this conversation. I look forward to many more. Hopefully in the future, we can do it together in Jerusalem, all three of us sitting together for some coffee and some tea, maybe some shisha as well, and discuss these issues and be able to, empower our own communities. Because at the end of the day, me and you are just one, right? We're
to win. I want that person to defeat the opposition, my rival, my enemy. It's very easy to slip into that narrative. Every one of us has done it, because that's the nature of what we're taught debates are. I hope that we can start entering these discussions, these dialogues, with a different intention, an intention to listen, even if not to change your mind, but at least to better understand the other side and not just want any one of them to win. And I think it takes a lot of courage for anyone to do that and discard what they were previously taught. I thank each one of you and I respect each one of you. Salam.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. It was a great pleasure. And I'm looking forward to doing this again. And everybody watching, have a beautiful weekend. Shabbat Shalom. Juma Mubarak. I think I said that right.
Juma Mubarak. Yeah, Juma Mubarak.
Yalla.
Salam.
Shalom.